I'm going to review briefly 3 quotes from the book Wiseeguy that I posted under week 12, and then I will introduce the visual patterns and the themes of the conclusion of Goodfellas, and I want to go through as much as possible of that conclusion, stopping in between scenes to discuss what elements that I alerted you to of the visual pattern you identified during the viewing of the film. The first passage is from chapter 3. It's a very interesting passage. These 3 passages are only half a page long or so, and it focuses on the wild nature of people such as Tommy, Jimmy, and to an extent Henry himself, and many of their fellow wise guys. That is to say, the seemingly paradoxical idea that exactly because these guys are so quick to resort to violence and so unpredictable, then they don't need to use violence all the time, because their reputation for being quick to violence creates an aura of deterrence around them. So people fear them and respect them exactly because they're out of control. It is still a paradoxical concept. It's only Machiavellian to a degree, right? Machiavelli likes the idea that violence has to be replaced by deterrence as often as possible. However, being wild, being cowboys, being uncontrollable, places these guys outside of the proper Machiavellian view of control and how to achieve control in a given context. In other films, in books such as The Godfather, these kinds of characters, the wild, beastly killers, are manipulated and exploited by the higher level capos, the dons, the same way that the Don uses Luca Brasi, and the Don proclaims that he himself is afraid of Luca. But while some measures can be taken to limit the consequences of the uncontrolled violence deployed by guys such as Tommy, there is also an element of instability. So we cannot call this kind of reflection aligned with Machiavellian thought, with the proper systematic Machiavellian model. It's an interesting attempt to provide a different angle to uncontrollable violence, to the proclivity of violence. And after all, even in the film Goodfellas, there are consequences to be paid. In fact, we will begin the sequence of the conclusion of the film exactly from the murder of Tommy, who, after falling prey to his own anger and uncontrollable violence when he kills Billy Bats, will then later on be killed himself. And this, in fact, signals the beginning of the chaotic conclusion, the fall from grace, right? From that point on, nobody in that small group, Jimmy, Paulie, Henry, Tommy, can control the situation. Just that, and you can find the whole passage under week 12. Insularity is a quote, a keyword from the next passage, just to remind you that in Machiavellian fashion, organized crime works in a Machiavellian way, achieving almost complete control for a period of time by acting within a well-defined context where they can control, where they can achieve control through a top-to-bottom approach, having an organization, having a pyramid, a hierarchy of criminals working for them at different levels, but also enjoying the support of the locals. And this has happened in small enclaves within New York City. Something like that is mentioned in The Last Dawn by Mario Puzo. It has happened in small areas of the region of Sicily. It still happens in small areas of Naples. For example, specific neighborhoods such as Scampia, or small areas of Calabria and Puglia, or Puglia in English. We must also say that this worked much better in the 20th century, when society was less porous, and in today's society, with increased mobility by people moving from areas to areas rather than living their whole existence in one place, as it used to be the case for places such as Naples, Sicily, or even the Bronx, or even Brooklyn, with increased mobility making it difficult to define who's the insider, who's the outsider. These strategies, achieving control by focusing on very specific context, work less and less. And finally, another concept that you found in Mario Puzo's The Last Dawn, and that you find in other films and books about organized crime, the idea that the pseudo-anthropological explanation of the existence in all societies of organized crime is that if your activity is not fully legal, you cannot go to the police, you cannot get justice from the justice system, and therefore, whom do you go to obtain justice or to elicit protection from scamming? You go to another criminal. You go to a higher level criminal. So you're a low-level criminal, or you're just a shopkeeper who's smuggling some of the merchandise in. You invoke the protection of the highest echelon of organized crime so that they can stop low-level criminals or cops from bothering you. It's a pseudo-anthropological explanation. There is some credence that we can give to it, but in fact, what we see in reality, demonstrated by journalists and judges who've investigated this phenomenon, what we see is that wherever you find protection promised and maintained partially by a criminal organization, you also find that the very people, the customers, so to speak, the people who believe they can get protection from this organization become victims themselves. And then they have no recourse. Then there is no one they can go to. Nor on the criminal side, neither on the criminal side nor on the police enforcement side. And this has been well documented, even if you go back to the 19th century, to the books exploring the roots of criminal organizations such as the mafia. You find plenty of anecdotal evidence that the mafia will, at times, not systematically, so you can enjoy their protection most of the time, but there always comes a time when you're cheated, scammed, robbed, threatened, abused in some way by the very organization that promised protection, because they know that you are their captive, that you have no recourse, that you cannot go anywhere else. And then you also find some of these victims of protection, shopkeepers, businessmen, opening their eyes, trying too late to uncover what is going on in an area, and especially in Italy, I'm familiar with those cases, but I'm sure the same can be true here, and then they're gunned down. They're eliminated before this can support a full investigation and judicial actions, right? Condemnation, verdict. So let's talk about the conclusion of Goodfellas. Keep in mind my lecture and the models I introduced on Tuesday. The basic concept is the following. In films such as The Godfather, I've cut some of the picture, there is a clear distinction. There is still a clear distinction between regular life and criminal life. And characters are somewhat desperately or vainly trying to recover normalcy, to go back to or guarantee for some of their family members a regular life. The distinction is very clear. Regular life is maintained intact. There is an effort to protect the life of the family from the consequences of the criminal activities of the mafia leaders, of the Don Vito, of Michael. What makes Goodfellas different, and what made it so popular, because after The Godfather, it's certainly the most famous in this genre of the gangster movie, is exactly the fact that there is no regular baseline for the lives of characters, not even for Karen, who from the very beginning, as we remarked, from the time she starts dating Henry, behaves in a way that is different from a traditional housewife, so to speak. What makes this film unique is the fact that there is a very short distance between the high dramatic tension of criminal life and the stability, the balance, the slow pace of regular life. The two are very close, juxtaposed, they overlap a lot, to the point where criminal life is not displayed, represented as some kind of dramatic, heroic things. Criminal life acquires a domestic quality, less heroic. Almost like the life of an employee, only this employee, Henry Hill, is working for a criminal organization. But he gets out of the house, go to do his job, comes back, etc. And regular life is so inextricably mixed, intertwined with crime, that the family, the house, are not a refuge any longer. They're not a place such as it would be for Vito and Michael, where you can have a vegetable garden to play with your kids and enjoy a moment that is pure, not affected by everything else. No, there is no refuge in this kind of life, and instead everything is corroded by constant tension. So the final sequence starts, even though we will go back to the previous episode of the murder of Joe Pesci, because it's such a nice episode and a very great segue to the rest. But in that sequence, we start with the chronicle of the day, by the end of which Henry Hill is arrested by narcs, by cops working on drug trafficking. And this happened in real life. And then he turns on his friends, becomes a collaborator, and the final scene is Henry outside of the house where he has been placed as part of the witness protection program. So he has turned into a civilian, a regular husband. And the film ends with a few texts about his relationship with Karen, their divorce, him being in the protection plan, but things did not stay stable for long. He went back to crime. He was kicked off from the witness protection plan. So what do we see constantly as a strategy throughout this last 30 minutes or so of the film? As I was saying before, as part of this overlap between regular life and criminal life, you see that the criminal activities performed by Henry in the last part of the film are lower down to the level of errands, right? It's like he has a list of things to do, he has to fit everything in his day, he's running from place to place, but you don't see, you lose the lore of crime, right? Again, it's like a regular guy, but instead of having a sandwich in his brown bag, he has a few guns. Instead of selling a vacuum cleaner, he's selling drugs, right? But there is nothing heroic, nothing cowboy-like at this point in his criminal life. What's interesting, of course, last time we watched scenes where there were dissonant elements suggesting that there is something in that apparent normality that signals that it is not such, is not so normal. In this case, the flow of each task, right? Henry is trying to perform these tasks. He has to sell guns, he has to sell drugs, etc. He has to pick up his brother. Each task, the flow of each task, is interrupted or complicated by other events. So you have a symbolic premonition that the same will happen to his life in general, that the flow of his life will be disrupted. And the next point is just the same. The task is not completed or is completed in different ways. There are complications in the conclusion. Of course, the camera tracking, moving with the character, or the editing, jumping quickly from one camera angle to another, add to this sense of urgency. We need to move quickly before it is too late. And of course, this creates a state of tension. As I said before, domesticity is a theme, so there is something trivial, domestic in the criminal side of Henry's day, but then there is also this heightened sense of the relevance of the family, because the character is about to lose everything, right? His life is about to be upended completely. And therefore, exactly in this last 30 minutes, you find a lot of visual references to food. Of course, there is food throughout the whole film, but especially here. And more references to family. You see more of Henry's and Karen's family life here than in the rest of the film. Because of this, they want to insist on this idea of the family and the domestic life that they're about to lose. There is a lot of sharing of tasks, a lot of tasks that bring people in the family together. What you see less of is the friendship and camaraderie that existed between Henry and Tommy and Jimmy. In fact, the opposite is true, that you see this is already happening, the loss of familiarity, the loss of camaraderie, the these people who were so close to one another and cared so much for one another are not as close. Because of course their connections were not built on anything lasting. And overall, in here, the element of disappointment is that in spite of everything, cooking together, eating together, doing things for each other or with each other, there is this profound emptiness, lack of satisfaction, lack of fulfillment, right? And then everything precipitates with Henry's arrest. To be noted in terms of the differences. Oh my God, this keyboard. Don't buy this particular Logitech keyboard. Okay, I have some of what I want. Key differences between the book chapters on this and the film. One interesting difference is that the book really gives you a sense. Chapter 20 and 21 rely also on reports by the police, by the narcs who arrested Henry, that Henry was indeed a big-time drug trafficker. The book refers to Henry moving 8 kilos per week. That would be 18 pounds, roughly, per week, right? Can you imagine? We're talking about 1,000 pounds per year, right? So not a small fish who then is pardoned in exchange for collaboration. And that's just for whatever is trafficking, which I always confuse heroin and cocaine. One of the two is trafficking in. And on top of that, we know that he was trafficking in pills. And keep in mind that all the locations in real life that correspond to what you'll see in the film are somewhere on Long Island. Rockville Center, Carmack. If you read those chapters, you find plenty of Long Island addresses. Just to say that if you think that Long Island is a quiet place, well, at least in the 1980s and 90s, probably into the 2000s, Long Island was not famous for criminal activities, heists, robberies, but the mafia all over Long Island had deposits, houses where drugs and weapons were stored and then retrieved and to be used. Okay? What comes out strongly in the conclusion of the book is that Henry Hill is really a social ghost. And this you will find in the film as well. At the end of the film, it'll be Henry talking to you as the spectator, explaining that his social security was fake, his phony, his driver's license was phony, never paid taxes, everything he owned was under somebody else's name, right? So there were no records of him. What made him an interesting target for the police was the fact that he was moving across levels of the hierarchy of the mafia organization he was working with, which gives you a more realistic sense, yes, we think, especially through The Godfather, of the pyramid, right, where you have the boss, and then the capos, the capo regime, and the various soldiers levels, and then those who are not made men yet, but are working for the soldiers. But in fact, there are no clear boundaries dividing these levels, and you do find people who communicate with the top, the bottom. They're not really insulating themselves as well as the films on the mafia pretend they are. So Henry, the book says, knew something about everything, and therefore he was useful as a witness. But that's true more or less of criminals at all levels, because it's very true from memoirs and from trial documents that these criminals spend a lot of time with insiders and very little time with outsiders. But when they're with insiders, they talk. When they're in prison, they talk constantly. They tell each other stories constantly, false and true stories, right? Not everything the mafiosi will tell you that they were not eyewitnesses to is in fact true. Let's see where we go. Here. Okay, let me adjust it here. Okay, and mind you, I am not such a boomer. I can build a computer. My desktop computer I built myself, but this keyboard, I don't know, is made to surprise you whenever you touch it. What the book emphasizes, and you find some of that in the film, is that people such as Henry Hill are constantly on the phone for their business. And therefore, when they're tapped, yeah, of course, they're trying not to say things on the phone that might incriminate them. But try talking on the phone 10 hours a day and see if you can bring the same level of attention to every conversation. And then, of course, they're using codes. In Henry's case, because we have the trial, they were saying, they were talking about selling gems, opals, gems, jewelry, right? But what kind of code is it? It's so clear, it was so clear they were selling drugs and pills, right? So to the point where in court, during the trial, they brought in a gem expert to say they couldn't be possibly talking about real opals because the prices don't match market prices. Okay, so it took very little to convince the jury that we're not talking about gems, but it was just code for drugs. It is in this part of the book that you find the scene that you saw in class earlier with Karen welcoming the FBI to her home and then watching TV, saying some of the wives will spit at them, but they're spitting on their floor. This is a passage based on a passage towards the end of the film when they have this big search. And it's not done the same way with the same details. It seems simplified, but in fact, when the police went to their home in Rockville Center, they couldn't find the drugs. They were hidden so well, they couldn't find them. They searched the room where the drugs were and couldn't find them. And then during the trial, unlike the movie, Karen didn't know where the drugs were in the house. And when Karen saw at the arraignment, one of the preliminary apparitions, when Henry appeared in front of the judge, he gave her a signal with his hand, something like this, and she understood perfectly that we're behind a part of the structure of a ledger in the house. And then she got rid of the drugs in case additional searches would find it. Something that is different, or probably transferred to another character, is that the last time Henry sees Paul Sorvino, and tries to get his forgiveness, Paulie gives everything he has in his pocket, which is about $3,000. And this has been true, as far as we know, from mafia leaders killed, and some of them testifying that during the 1980s and 90s, they would make sure they had thousands of dollars in their pocket. And we're talking about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, so a lot of money. Because they strongly believed that they needed protection. Protection could be a gun, although a gun can be incriminating. And protection is a lot of money because cash can get you out of situations. You bribe a policeman, or let's say you have an accident and there are guns in your car, you cannot wait for the police to draft a report. You just tell the other guy, here is the money, have your car fixed, and you leave. So Paulie gives everything, this wad of cash, to Henry. Henry, of course, remarks that after a lifetime of services from the age of 14, he was liquidated with $3,200. But then, in the book, Henry says that while he's leaving, he saw that Paulie was crying. And Paulie, in the film, says, I have to turn my back on you, meaning I give you this money, this is my last form of support, but then we're done here. And his face is always stolid, no emotion there, but we do see another guy, tough guy, crying, and that is Jimmy, after he learns that Tommy Joe Pesci was killed. So, what can you tell me? Let's start from the last part of the sequence, when Henry Ray Liotta breaks out of character and speaks to you directly, breaking the fourth wall, the illusion of the film, saying, we control cops, judges, we were so powerful. How would you interpret that in the context of the film? Because clearly that statement cannot be taken at face value, right? When Harry Hill is telling you how much power they had, even over cops and judges, how should we react? Wait.
I think like shocked, because their mom was close, like they were like growing up together, like that's what they grew up with, and then you just feel something else.
But what's the context for that statement? Is the context supporting the veracity of the statement of their power over cops and judges? Or is the context nullifying the statement? Oh, why is it nothing? It doesn't mean anything. That statement has no ground, right? Because it's a statement about power over cops and judges uttered by a character who just stood up from the witness chair, was forced to collaborate with the police. He had no control over cops and judges. Whatever he said is either a claim that is the product of his own bravado, right? Because you know that Henry is kind of a salesman of himself, right? That is pretending to be better than he is. Or it's a statement that is ironic because it's contradicted by the facts. Their power could not save them from that trial and the consequences of their actions. Paulie went to prison, died there. Conway went to prison, died towards the end of his sentence or right after he came out. And he went to witness protection plan, and then he failed that as well, was kicked out because he went back to a life of crime. Right? So it's just another statement that tells you about the lore of the criminal, but with no supportive evidence. In fact, everything in the scene is contradicted. Right?
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Okay. What else can you tell me in general about the sequence, or any reaction, not just specific points? The whole thing we saw. Pick something or give me a general reaction, Lisa.
I remember you mentioning the theme of like disappointment, and I feel like that end scene is perfectly represented. That literally every single character is disappointed. Paulie, Conway, Henry.
In one way or the other. Right?
And they didn't even show it, but Henry's children, everybody was disappointed. you know.
Yeah.
So I feel like that was perfectly represented.
Yeah, and then that's another angle on the traditional crime doesn't pay trope. Not in a moralistic sense, but at a human level. Whatever they were chasing, they never got it, or they only got it ephemerally for a few instants, and then it flew. It escaped there from their lives. What else? Other comments or specific observations? Yes?
You really get the theme of disappointment also when Karen goes to see Jimmy and he's sending her off to go get hit, basically. And the scene where she looks back and he does the little wave on her, you can tell she's just heartbroken because earlier in the film it shows how they would like go on vacations together, they would just constantly be at each other's houses, they would their kids were like intertwined because they went to birthday parties and everything. So it really shows there too.
In a way, it's like the scene about trust with Calogero and Sonny in the Bronx Tale, where Calogero is so surprised that Sonny would manhandle him and abuse him physically and verbally, and then Sonny has to confess, I cannot trust anybody. And that's the same. There is no foundation for real support among these people since they cannot fully trust each other, right? And that's also the essence of the scene at the diner, right? Which is the two characters putting up a face for each other, trying to pretend they don't know what the game is, what the scene is about. Any visual cues to the theme of domesticity in regards to various characters, for example, Henry, or even Jimmy? How do you see Jimmy at the end of the film? How is he different visually from the Jimmy at the beginning? Of course, he's older, right? His hair is gray. What else do you see that makes him less than a hero?
The fact that the fact that he was using cocaine also damaged it. It was already showing on his figure. The fact that he put in jeopardy the whole family without not caring is wrong treatment.
Although they all behave like that, right?
They
It's
all
not just Henry.
do, but he put them in jeopardy without caring because most of the time he was on cocaine.
Okay. This is regards to Henry. What about Jimmy? How do you see Jimmy changed in the last part of the film? Some not so visual changes. The glasses, the goofy glasses, right? The glasses that make his eyes bigger, and you feel less intimidated by Jimmy compared to the beginning when you saw him finish off Billy Bats. What else? How else you saw Jimmy?
He seems more like emotional, like you can see more of his facial expressions and stuff, and that definitely knocks down like the fear factor from him.
Yeah, his facial expressions are not positive or defiant. But what else? I was thinking about the robe, the blue robe that he has on when he opens the door to examine the guns that Henry brought, right? Which is another domestic element that detracts from the heroic quality of the characters. They're not cowboys anymore. However, at the end you see Tommy, right? It's just a flashback of sorts. You see Tommy pointing guns towards the audience and shooting, and that brings back the idea that they thought they were cowboys. They thought they were the incarnation of these legendary criminals from the past. In fact, the scene, visually, the way it is framed by the admission of Scorsese himself, is based on a silent film from the early 1900s called The Great Train Robbery. You find it on YouTube, I think it's only 15-20 minutes. And there, at some point, you see one of the criminals pointing the gun and shooting at the audience, which was very impressive for the people, the spectators of that era, more than it did more than it did for us. Okay, I just want to remind you briefly before we leave. Go back. Want to put the calendar up. Okay, because we're quick approaching. So next week is the final weeks of lecture. I'll be talking about Donnie Brasco as usual, and the book it is based on. The week after that, keep in mind that we have class presentations on Tuesday and Thursday. So if you weren't here, you can go back to the video that you find on the Class Wiki or on my YouTube channel from April 3rd. April 3rd is when I offered suggestions and details about the presentations in class. You need to present on your final project, but you don't need to have the whole project ready. You can just pick a scene, a theme, a character from that and focus your presentation on one aspect of your project. And keep in mind that the final project is due on Thursday, May 15th. Okay, of course, if you need help with your project, even past the last week of lectures, you just have to let me know. I'm not flying to Europe or some other exotic locale. I'll be on campus between now and commencement every day as usual. So whether it be on Zoom or in person, I can support your efforts toward a successful presentation and the final project. Of course, for the presentations, I'm going to send you an email during the next few days with the date of your presentation. I have to split the class between Tuesday and Thursday. So if you insist, if you want to volunteer for Tuesday, let me know, and otherwise I'll just feed the names into a randomizer and get some of the people on a Tuesday schedule for the presentation, some of the people on a Thursday schedule. Okay? We still have a couple of minutes for questions about this. Yes?
So we're writing, pretty much we're doing a slide presentation on a character that kind of.
So the first thing would be to pick a film for your final project.
Okay.
And then for the presentation, come not with a summary of the whole project, because the project will be submitted on May 15 and I read everything. You pick the most interesting aspect and you try to do some of what I did in class, going from a short scene, as an example, to its thematic analysis in reference to the representation of criminals and criminal life in that particular film. Okay? So in the presentation, be strategic, be selective, because the whole thing will be the project. You need to duplicate what the project is. You just need to show that you're able to discuss the project or some aspects of the project, not just write about it. Okay? And therefore, as I suggested, you can certainly bring some notes with you, but don't be reading from a PowerPoint or from your notes. Discuss, introduce the scene you want to show. If that's how you want to articulate, I think it would be best for the others who are following the presentation and might not know enough about the film to pick a scene. And of course, you can let me know in advance if you need me to bring a film to make the film you're presenting on available on one of the tabs of the browser so that you can quickly find your scene, show it, and then continue with your analysis. Don't worry about the formality of the delivery, about saying every word precisely as it should be in a text. It's a presentation, so it can be colloquial. The most important things are the ideas, the clarity, how convincing your presentation is in terms of conveying ideas, themes, and analysis for this film.
And the final paper has to be 750 words or?
No. That the length of the assignments. The final paper should be between 2,000 and 3,000 words, something like that. It's in the syllabus. Let me find it so we can be exact. Including quotes, eventually. So it would be a more extensive endeavor, but along the same lines of the assignments, as long as you got the assignments right, that is to say, start with the scenes, start with the evidence, right? The syllabus has some details. Get there. Yeah, I was correct. Between 2,000 and 3,000 words, including quotes from the film, if you're quoting the dialogue, included what might be the description of a scene that brings out some visual elements that corroborate the analysis of the actions.
I'm not 100% sure yet, but is it okay to talk about, for my project to be about a film that I did in one of my shorter assignments?
As long as you find, so in the syllabus you find a list of suggested films that we didn't touch upon, because I wanted to give you the opportunity to do something original and not derivative. However, I also said in class earlier this month that if you find an angle that is different from the lectures, clearly your project shouldn't be a summary of notes you took in class or things that were analyzed to death in class. But if you find a fresh angle on one or more of the films that were shown in class, that would be fine, as long as you, first of all, generally align yourself with the class, showing that you've learned from the lectures, and then you're not just repeating what you heard in class in reference to that particular film.